Well, good morning. Good, the mic is working. Let me get situated. It's good to see all of you this morning. My name is Stuart, as they said, and I'm one of the leaders here at River. If I have not had the opportunity to meet you yet, which there are a lot of new faces these days, which is awesome, but it means I probably haven't met you yet. So I would love to meet you and engage with you. And on behalf of myself, the rest of the River leadership team, our members, welcome. We're glad that you're here, that you're celebrating Jesus with us this morning. I thought it would be helpful. We're continuing our sermon series that we've been in this semester through Romans, and we're going to continue that this morning. I thought we're in a bit of a transition passage this morning, so I thought what I would do is actually kind of step back, pan out a little bit, and give a kind of an overview of where we are, what we've looked at over the past couple weeks, and then kind of where we're going over the coming weeks, just to help everyone get situated. And then we'll kind of dive into our passage this morning. If you want to go ahead and turn there, we're going to be in the middle of chapter 3, verses 9 through 20. But before we dig in there, let me give just a brief summary and a little bit of context for why Paul is writing, who he's writing to, and what he's writing about. So the Apostle Paul is the author of the book of Romans. It was actually a letter to a church there in Rome. And he's writing to this group of people that he's never met. Unlike a lot of the letters that Paul wrote in the New Testament, this was not to a church that he had planted, right? This was to a group of people he'd never met before. However, he hoped to travel to Rome and to spend some time with them. And so he's writing, kind of expressing that desire. And then also, there is some scholars kind of think that he might have been concerned that he would never actually get to Rome. So there's a sense in this letter, as you read it, there's a lot of like heavy doctrine issues that he leads with, and it has a different feel from some of the other letters that he writes. And the reason we think he might be doing that is because there's an urgency to share truth with these people through this letter that he's concerned he might not actually be able to do in person, right? So that's a little bit of a background for the reason for the writing of this letter. Now let's talk about what he's covered so far. So we're in the middle of chapter 3. He begins the book with the standard greeting, and then right up front in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, he lays out the main premise, the main point that everything else in this letter is going to tie back to. And I'm going to read it just because it needs to be front of mind for us as well. In verse 16 and 17 of Romans chapter 1, he writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek," or the Gentile. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So he lays out this central point, and then beginning in verse 18 of chapter 1, running through the end of our passage today, chapter 3, verse 20, he really addresses the reality of the human condition, the reality of the human condition. And he begins by talking about our nature. We are all sinful. We are all sinful. We are all broken. We fall short. And then he talks about, in chapter 2, the reality that God is the judge. And not just that he is the judge, but he is just and righteous in his judgment. And then he begins to talk about the law and the mechanism that serves, the purpose it serves in God's economy. And now, beginning in verse 9 this morning, he's going to wrap this first section up, give us a summary, and then next week, we're going to start in the next kind of big, overarching section of the book, which is going to focus on how you and I can be made right before God. Or another like big kind of like spiritual word is justification by faith. How can you and I be justified before God through faith? Okay, that's great, Stuart. Thank you for that context and background and great. Why? why is Paul spending so much time talking about this, telling us that me, you, we are sinful, broken people? Why would he do that? Well, because he wants his readers, he wants us to understand the reality of our situation. And the reason for that is because when you understand reality, you have a different perspective, and your response changes. Let me give you an example. This would be about 15 years ago. My wife and I were still fairly new in our marriage, and we had two little guys at the time, and let's see, it would have been the summer of 2009, and we began to notice with our firstborn that something was off. Something wasn't quite right, and we didn't know what it was. We were still pretty new parents, and so we'd gone through like your common colds and like the new baby phase, but we could just tell like he wasn't acting the way he normally would. Things like he would be exhausted, and we would lay him down to sleep, and he would wake up within about 30 minutes and just be overwhelmingly thirsty. There were other signs. I'm not going to get into all of it, but we knew that something was not right. Now, we did everything that we could based on the knowledge of his condition that we had at the time to try to address whatever it was that was going on, but we didn't understand the reality of the situation. So finally, after a couple weeks, we took him to the hospital. We took him to the urgent care, and they got in there, and they ended up checking his blood sugar, and his blood sugar reading was over 800. So for context, you or I, most of us in this room right now, our blood sugar probably ranges between 80 and 120. His was 10 times the typical limit. And the reason was his pancreas had begun shutting down in that it was no longer producing the insulin needed to break down the sugars in his blood. Something that's standard for you and I. He had type 1 diabetes. Now, if we had not gone to the hospital and we'd not understood the reality of his condition, we would have done the very best that we could, but it wouldn't have been good enough. And it would have resulted in significant impact to his well-being, his ability to live a normal life. It could have led to death. Often it does. But as soon as we understood what was going on in his body, we were able to address the issue. And he's sitting right here today, and you'd never know he has type 1 unless he tells you, because we were able to get the care and the support that he needed. In a similar way, what Paul is trying to do is he's trying to open the eyes of his readers and explain the diagnosis of what is going on inside of them, what is going on inside of you and me. Okay, so with that context, let's turn to our passage this morning. We're going to be in chapter 3 of Romans, starting in verse 9. I'm going to pick it up there. For what then? And he's carrying forward this argument he's been making in the preceding set of verses, the first part of chapter 3. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. Okay, let's pause there real quick and just, again, get our bearings. What is he talking about here? Well, at the tail end of that verse, he says all, both Jews and Greeks. This, like I said, is carrying on an argument that he's already laid out in the preceding passage, but what he's trying to communicate is pretty clear, that all of us, regardless of your heritage, your race, all of us are under sin, is what he says. This, like I said, doesn't have anything to do with your heritage, your family name, how religious you might be. You were still subject and under sin. Okay, so then he says sin. What does that word mean? What does that idea convey? Well, here and throughout the New Testament, the idea of sin is to miss the mark, right? To miss the mark, to fall short of God's standard. You and I, often when we think about sin, I would imagine that your view is sometimes the way I view sin, which is kind of on a relative person-to-person basis, right? Well, I'm not as bad as that guy because I don't do the things that he does, or I'm not as bad as her because I can see her life and my life doesn't look like her. So we look at sin sometimes on a relative basis. What Paul is talking about here is that sin needs to be considered from God's perspective, not from my perspective. A holy and righteous God in whose presence sin cannot abide. So we're all under sin. What does under mean? What does that idea convey? Well, to be under sin means to be under its domination or condemnation. Domination. You can't escape. It dominates you. You can't free yourself. You can't be liberated from it. One scholar put it this way: the problem with people is not just that they commit sin, you and I. Their problem is that we are enslaved to it. And we on our own cannot break free. I'll develop this idea a little bit more here in a few minutes, but I want to leave that there. So why is being under sin important? Why is it important? Why would Paul place such an emphasis on this? Well, he wants his readers there in the church of Rome to understand the reality of their situation. They were infected with sin. And there will be a consequence. JT talked on this a couple weeks ago, but all the way back in verse 18 of chapter 1, Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." As he laid out a couple weeks ago, God's wrath is not an emotional reaction, the way that you and I often get angry. His wrath is not emotional. It's a steadfast opposition against all that is evil, and it's essential to his character. And because he is holy, his justice will rightly be revealed against sin and ungodliness. Okay, we're all under sin. That feels kind of heavy. I see a few eyebrows out there. Yeah, it is. It is. But that's reality. That's reality. And Paul wants us to understand our reality. So let's turn to that next passage, starting in verse 10. Paul builds on his argument, and he's going to reach back into the Old Testament and mold several different passages together to flesh out a couple of additional ideas related to our domination under sin. Beginning in verse 10 and reading through 12, "As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one." Okay, what do you notice about this? What do you notice about this passage? None, no one, not one, all. Okay, this is again the idea of all of us that he was pushing at the end of verse 9. Something else I want you to notice, though. These are all heart-level statements. No one understands. No one seeks for God. No one does good. Paul is making the point that sin begins on a heart level. On a heart level. Let's think about the pattern then that sin works. If it begins on a heart level, that means that it works from an inside-out process. Does that make sense? It starts in here, and then it works its way out. So what would that look like? Read down in verse 13 through 18. For their throat is an open grave. They use their tongue to deceive. What is he talking about? He's talking about our words, right? It starts in our heart, and then it's going to manifest itself in our words. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed evil. What is he talking about now? He's talking about our actions. In their path are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. Our actions, we can do good things, but at the end of the day, does not result in peace. Results in ruin and misery. Verse 18, he turns to our attitudes. There's no fear of God before their eyes. I think I have up there, sin is not a sometimes thing. That's the point he's trying to push home, drive home here. Another way of thinking about that is sin impacts all of us all of the time. All of the time. I'm going to throw a big kind of spiritual phrase at you, but I'm going to back it up with an illustration, so hopefully it hits. This is the idea of total depravity. Total depravity. Some of you have heard about that. Some might be like, what is he talking about? Total depravity. Total depravity is the idea not that everything that you do is as broken and bad as it could be, as sinful as it could be. That's not the idea of total depravity. It's as bent and broken as it could be. The idea of total depravity is that everything we do is tainted by sin. There's some authors that define it better than I can, so I'll lean on them for just a minute. Total depravity does not mean that every person is as bad as he or she could be. It means that sin has affected every part of his or her being, and consequently, there is nothing anyone can do to commend himself or herself to a holy God. So I promised an illustration, and I hope that this helps drive my point home. This is your life. Jar of water, okay? Jar of water. And a lot of us, this is how we view sin and the way that it taints our life. I've got some 2-cycle oil in here. A lot of you already know what's going to happen. I'm going to add this. Don't want to spill. Okay, what happened? What do you see? It's tainted, but has it fully permeated the water? No, it kind of sits on top, kind of separates out. For some of us, this is how we view our lives. Yeah, there's some bad stuff in there. But if we could just get rid of that, if we could scoop that out, I might still be able to drink this. I wouldn't recommend that, but some of you might be thinking that, okay? It kind of separates out, and this is how a lot of us view sin in our lives. Now I'm going to show you the idea of total depravity. Again, I do some bad things, but there's a lot of good things. This is just green food dye. What's going to happen? Could you drink this without getting any food dye? No. Why? It's permeated with that dye. In a similar way, our lives have been permeated with sin. And when God views us, he does not see this. Well, there's a lot of good in there, a little bit of bad. I'll just take care of the bad, and then they'll be okay. He sees this. This is reality. So he has crafted a response to address our reality. Okay, let's move on. Home stretch, verses 19 and 20. Main point here is we cannot justify ourselves. Picking it up in verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. And that's all of us, right? Every mouth, that's all of us. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. So, he's kind of going back to this same idea that we've seen a couple different times, right? All the world may become accountable to God. This is all of us. He's very much using the method of I'm going to tell him what I'm going to tell him, I'm going to tell him, and then I'm going to tell him what I told him, right? He's hitting it again. And then by works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. What is he saying there? What's that idea? Well, I talked a little bit earlier about sin working in an inside-out mechanism, right? Starts in our heart, permeates everything. If we're honest, a lot of us use outside-in tactics to address our sin. So we do things like we'll modify behavior. We'll modify our behavior. I'll do better. I won't do that anymore. I'll carve off the bad stuff at the top if I just change my behavior and the rest is going to be okay. Or we'll minimize our sin. It's really not that bad. It's not impacting anyone else. It's just me. It's just me. No one else knows. It's not impacting anyone. Or we'll balance the scales. A lot of us like this one. I like this one. Well, I did some bad stuff. I'm just going to balance it out with some good stuff. Throw some charity in there, give my money, give my time. That'll even it out. And it'll take care of this bad stuff. But these don't truly address what's going on inside of you or me. They're all works, the way that Paul describes them there. The works of the law, no human being will be justified. Paul is saying our attempts to work for or earn any kind of justification in God's eyes will never be sufficient. Never work. Going back to my son, with type 1 diabetes, you can live a pristine lifestyle. Eat only good things. Get the required amount of exercise. But the reality is that will not change his condition. Why? Because that's us working on the outside to try to work in. And that will never work. It will never work. He needs an inside-out solution to truly be healed. And you and I do too. You and I do too. Just like sin begins on a heart level and works its way out, we need a solution that begins on a heart level. We'll dive into this more in the coming weeks. But what is that solution? Well, let's go back to the main idea, the big idea that Paul began this book with back in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. We come to God by faith, on the basis of what he has done, not by works of the law, not by anything that you or I could do, but on the basis of what he has done. So what now? What do we do with this? Paul's making it clear. He wants us to understand our reality. What do we do as we understand our reality? I'm going to leave you with 2 points, 2 ideas. First, embrace the reality of your situation. embrace the reality of your situation. You are impacted by sin. And not just part of you, all of you. We are all under sin, and our sin has separated us from God. His holiness demands justice. And the correct and appropriate response is his wrath. Also, sin is not a sometimes thing. It impacts all of us all of the time. It begins in our heart, and then it works its way out in our words, our actions, our attitudes. And we cannot justify ourselves. My works will never address my sin. I cannot address the debt that I owe. I can't bridge the chasm between me and God that my sin has created. So we need to embrace the reality of our situation, but we also need to embrace the reality of the gospel. Embrace the reality of the gospel. What does that mean? Here in a couple weeks, we're going to look at Romans 5:8, which says, "But God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, while we were still separated from him, Christ died for us." He took the initiative to move toward us. Even though our lives look like this, he took the initiative to send his son to die on our behalf, to pay what we cannot, to provide an inside-out solution for the issues that you and I can never rectify ourselves. That is the reality of the gospel. That's the reality of the gospel. So a couple things. One, if you have not yet put your faith in Jesus, if you sit there this morning, or if you're listening online, and you find yourself thinking, you know what? I want to have a relationship with God. I know that I am broken, that I'm separated from him. But honestly, everything I try to do is me just using my works to find something, to address something that I can never address, which is my heart. I'll invite you to do this. First, admit that you're a sinner, that you're broken, that your life looks like this. Believe that Jesus is the true and right sacrifice for that sin, and that the only way to peace with God is through him. And then commit to walk with him. Another way of saying that is pursue a relationship with him. Make him the Lord of your life. And if you're in that camp this morning, what I'd invite you to do is ponder that, and then come grab me, or maybe the person that you came to church with this morning, and address that issue. Don't let that question linger, but address it. Now, some of you have already put your faith in Jesus. Let me talk to you, and I'm talking to myself in this group as well. Have you been working or relying on outside-in solutions to please God? Have you, as Paul says here in verse 20 of chapter 3, been using works of the law to seek justification in his sight, to be pleasing to him? Yes, I came to Jesus through faith. I came to God through faith. But really, my life since that point has been me trying to earn his favor. If that's you, and honestly, often that is me, I'm going to invite you to do a couple things. One, stop. It won't work. It doesn't work. I can tell you it does not work. Now, let me be clear here. I am not talking about stepping away from any kind of spiritual discipline. I am not talking about stepping away from being involved in a community with other believers. That is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is stepping back from the posture or the expectation that just because you do that, you merit additional favor with God or you earn anything in His sight. He loves you already. He sent His Son already. What He wants is He wants a relationship with you. Right? So stop trying to earn something from Him and instead step in to just respond to Him. To respond to Him. As His child, respond to Him. Rest in His love. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the next couple weeks, so I'm not going to press into this point, but I do, some of you, as I talk about this, you might find yourself in that camp of just, man, I've been trying to earn God's favor. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. You need an inside-out solution that only He can provide. And as your loving Father, He's already done it. So what He wants you to do is respond to Him as a child that says, yes, Dad, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to follow. So I'm going to invite the band up. And as they come up, I'm going to just pray us out. Father, thank You for Your love. Thank You for the way that You have done what we could never do, to make a way to know You and to have peace with You. Lord, instead of being a people, instead of being a church that tries to earn or merit anything in Your sight, would You instead let us be a people who choose instead to walk in Your love, to follow You as a child who trusts their Father. Thank You for changing our reality. Help us to walk out of that. In Your name we pray, Lord Jesus. Amen.